One of my favourite tropes in storytelling is something called the man behind the man, or the greater scope villain. The idea that there's a more villainous person behind the currently established villain of the story. Spoilers for these stories real quick. Darth Vader is the bad guy of the original Star Wars trilogy, but we learn there's a bigger bad. Although Dush becomes a main antagonist by the end of Red Dead Redemption 2, we think of Micah as more of a villainous character. And with Final Fantasy VII, we have Sephiroth, who is the bad guy of the game right till the end. But we kinda conclude that Hojo is probably worse by the time the game ends. Of course, the three examples I just laid out differ a lot from each other. The man behind the man trope is not concrete. Tropes are often best utilised when writers use them with flexibility. When it comes to the character we are discussing today, he is an important player in the plot of the story. But I think as players we have our eyes set on Sephiroth being the big villain. He's extremely strong and he's attempting to destroy the planet. Yes, that is awful, I get it, but Sephiroth is cool.
Good to see you, Cloud.
I don't think he's a very hateable villain, even despite him doing unforgivable things such as killing Aerith. I know Final Fantasy tends to have a lot of similarities with Star Wars, and I think I feel somewhat similar about Vader and Sephiroth. Both are badasses and are hard to dislike. They're also both sympathetic. There's sorrow in their lives. But just like the deeper evil in these two stories, we have no sympathy for them. Hojo is maniacally evil, and I challenge you to tell me one positive thing about Hojo.
Oh, I'm listening! Waiting! I'm waiting! You have anything to say?
Yeah, didn't think so, considering there's not 1 ounce of goodness coming from him in the story. A man who values knowledge and scientific advancement above life itself. He's basically like the mad scientist archetype, except Hojo goes a few steps beyond into insanity. Though you may be familiar with the character, let's give a quick background up until the start of the game so I can easily highlight certain aspects later in the video. Also, I haven't played Dirge of Cerberus, and I've heard a lot of fans are not so happy with what it does to the story of FF7.
The faster you can erase this from your memory, the better you'll feel about Final Fantasy VII.
I will be mainly sticking with the original game, Crisis Core, and the remake trilogy for this video. If you don't think I should be making this video without experiencing Dirge of Cerberus, then sue me, I don't care. Not much is known about his early life, but what we do know is that at some point, Hojo joins Shinra as a scientist and works as Professor Gast's assistant, a man of high scientific intellect. For many years, Hojo remained Gast's assistant. One day, they travelled to Nibelheim and discovered Mount Nibel had a rich deposit of Mako. They stayed at the Shinra Manor established in Nibelheim while studying and carried out tests on their discovery. A long time later, they found a life form in stasis. They mistook it for a deceased female Cetra and named it Jenova. It was taken back to the Shinra building for further research. Gast eventually proved the Jenova project. The goal was to create a being with Cetra traits to help Shinra locate the Promised Land. The key players in the Jenova project were Hojo, another scientist called Hollander, Lucrezia, Vincent Valentine's love interest and eventual biological mother to Sephiroth, and Gast himself. There were two significant projects, Project S and Project G. Project G was overseen by Hollander and was aimed at creating enhanced humans. It created Angeal and Genesis, but it was eventually understood that the project was a failure. Project S, on the other hand, was overseen by Hojo. The goal was more in line with creating a being that could lead Shinra to the Promised Land, as they truly thought the life form they discovered was etc. Hojo married Lucrezia and she soon became pregnant. As a side note, this part is a little muddy as apparently in Dirge of Cerberus, it slightly retcons relationship between Hojo and Lucrezia. Apparently Hojo manipulated Lucrezia into his plan, and of course I haven't played Dirge, but it's not out of the world to assume that Hojo would do something such as manipulation in the pursuit of his goal. Anyway, Hojo injected Jenova cells into the fetus, and thus Sephiroth was born. A few years later, Hojo took over Shinra's research and development division as Gast left. Gast realized the truth of Jenova, that it was a malicious alien that brought about the near extinction of the Cetra. Disturbed by what the Jenova project had become and the increasingly unethical experiments done by Hojo, he resigned and went into hiding, eventually falling in love with Ifalna, the last known Cetra. Together, they had a daughter, Aerith. Unfortunately, Hojo and Shinra discovered Gast, Ifalna, and Aerith. It was like a gift to him that he was presented not just with the man he had been hunting for, but two individuals with Cetra blood. Hojo ordered Gast to be executed and then took Ifalna and Aerith and brought them to the Shinra headquarters in Midgar to study and learn more about the Setra's rumoured ability to find the Promised Land. After several years of imprisonment and unethical testing, Ifalna couldn't endure it any longer and she took Aerith and escaped, but Ifalna was dealt a fatal wound. She died in Sector 5 of Midgar, and Elmira takes Aerith in. Hojo distanced himself but continued to monitor Aerith through the use of Turks and Shinra operatives. One of the more disturbing little details about him was that he was adamant in cataloguing every single part of Ifalna's dead body. We get to hear this from him, especially in Remake when he taunts Aerith with it. After Sephiroth learns the truth about its existence and turns Nibelheim into a barbecue, through the efforts of Zack and Cloud, Sephiroth is defeated, though they pass out from taking critical damage. Hojo arrives and proceeds to experiment on the survivors of the incident in the Shinra Manor, creating the reunion theory. It consisted of injecting Zack and Cloud and the survivors of Nibelheim with Sephiroth cells and Mako. The successful subjects are the people in rows with the numbered tattoo that we see. Hojo's theory is that if the Jenova cells were disconnected, eventually the time will come for them to join back up together and make Jenova whole again to its full power. Why would Hojo want to revive an extremely powerful sinister alien, you may ask?
I have no idea!
But the test on Cloud and Zack was considered a failure in the eyes of Hojo, as Zack's body had rejected the testing done on him, likely because of his previous Jenova cell injection. Cloud had failed the test as he suffered from Mako poisoning, and they were both kept in the basement of Shinra Manor in a sort of comatose state. Fortunately for Zack, he broke out of the state one day and saved Cloud's life. However, Cloud was basically a vegetable because of the Mako poisoning. Zack soon perishes and Cloud overcomes the Mako poisoning, but the rest of his life is now affected because of Hojo's experiment. Around the same time, Nanaki, or Red 13, is captured and is a test subject for Hojo. Red species is known for having a much longer lifespan than that of a human. So, of course, Hojo is curious and he wants to study this by any means necessary. All this information I have listed happens before the start of Final Fantasy VII. We only get details later in the game and with the release of Crisis Core, which means, although we see Hojo do terrible stuff within the present time of our story, most of Hojo's evil doings are done in the past. This adds a lot of mystery to the story of FF7 and establishes that Hojo is a fundamental pillar for the whole plot. He sets it in motion. Without him, you wouldn't have Sephiroth, the reunion theory, Professor Gast's and Ifalna's death. Aerith would have been different because she would have grown up with her actual mother. Cloud's trauma that defines his character wouldn't be here. The echo of Hojo and his actions surrounds almost every crevice of this story. His impact is not to be overlooked at all. Every action Hojo takes is very often motivated by the goal of scientific advancement. This is especially true when it comes to Shinra. Though it makes perfect sense for Hojo to ally himself with an oppressive government that is evil in its own right, Hojo is not loyal to their ideas and goals. No, Hojo marches to the beat of his drum. He is not a follower. He likely only uses Shinra as they can aid him with the necessary resources to carry out his work. A line of dialogue in Remake suggests this assumption.
Come now, Aerith. You misunderstand my intentions. I wish only to satisfy their material greed, so I can be left to pursue my great work.
As the story progresses and Hojo comes to realize that the reunion theory is drawing near, Hojo over time distances himself from Shinra, to the point where towards the end of the game, Hojo willingly aids Sephiroth in his plan to summon Meteor and destroy the planet. He claims he wants to see what will happen, purely from scientific curiosity, even if it results in the end of the world. This means Shinra and Cloud's party are more aligned with each other than Hojo is with Shinra. It also shows that Hojo takes great pride in what Sephiroth has become, and he's willing to risk the end of the world just for knowledge. However, what makes Hojo's obsession with science so unsettling is the fact that he has a lot of power to pursue his work by any means necessary, and this is when he becomes most unethical. Final Fantasy VII has many different antagonists in the story, and they all serve a unique purpose and send a message to the audience. Sephiroth is like the fallen angel, showing someone who was once good can turn to evil. Shinra is a lot of things, but mainly corporate greed and lack of empathy for those who live under the system they've created. And Hojo represents unethical science, how someone can use intelligence as a weapon when it goes unchecked. He serves as a critique of scientists or institutions that value progress over humanity. Since science itself is neutral and doesn't have an idea of right and wrong, it is absolutely necessary for there to be a moral framework to work with. That's what our society has strived for, and we're all in unanimous agreement that that's a positive thing. Scientists work under codes of ethics, but Hojo is like,
No.
the Final Fantasy VII Remake loading screen lays it out best for us. Direct director of research and development, Hojo doesn't allow things like ethics to hold him back in the pursuit of knowledge. Together with the former director, they pioneered the soldier program, bathing subjects in Mako to enhance their battle performance. In the same game, the initial scene featuring him effectively conveys all necessary information regarding his character, whether he is a nice fella or not. I have previously addressed this in an earlier video, but if a writer wants to avoid hiding the nature of a character, revealing this information to the audience within the first scene is an effective approach. In this particular scene, Aerith finds herself as a captive while Hojo attempts to persuade her to assist him with his plans. He then makes a remark about Aerith's mother, AVALANCHE, inquiring whether she would like to see her mother. However, this would be through the lens of his microscope, as Hojo has meticulously documented every aspect of AVALANCHE, from bones to skin to hair and everything else. This is disturbing as he perceives Aerith's mother as his trophy, admiring her as much in death as in life. It represents a distortion of scientific inquiry. Moreover, the fact that he expresses this sentiment to Aerith while pressing against the glass like a weirdo just adds more to his vile nature.
As breathtaking in death as in life. As you, my dear.
Go away, you little reptilian. When this scene concludes, there is no uncertainty regarding our feelings towards Hojo. He is unequivocally not a good man. There is nothing within this scene that could lead us to form an alternative impression of him. If we fast forward to the board meeting, we see even more representation of his disregard for ethics. Understanding that making Aerith cooperate will be difficult, he asks President Shinra for permission to be able to do some type of psychological torture on Aerith, to ensure she will aid them. His permission is granted, however, President Shinra demands that Hojo not make the same mistake as he did with AVALANCHE. To mitigate the risks, Hojo suggests making Aerith reproduce with a worthy candidate from Soldier. Also, since hearing that Sephiroth has returned, according to Palmer, Hojo fantasizes about Sephiroth and Aerith creating offspring.
You weird, buddy.
If that wasn't enough for you, when we look at the original game, Hojo says that it will take over 100 years for Aerith to find the Promised Land. And of course, all of them will be dead before then. So since Aerith is the last hope for them to find the Promised Land, Hojo comes up with the brilliant idea of breeding Nanaki, whose species has a prolonged life trait, with Aerith. Yes, you heard that right. Breeding Aerith with an animal. Jeez, I hope there's no degenerative people out there that would want this. God, I just know there is though. The hope was to create a new specimen with the abilities of Cetra with the long life trait of Nanaki, and to secure the future of both species. These ideas are especially disgusting considering Aerith's consent in the matter is irrelevant to Hojo, as he views her more like a lab rat to be used in the pursuit of his goals. It also shows how his fascination with eugenics can lead to such ludicrous ideas. This idea of breeding Red and Aerith is deeply disturbing, a dehumanizing act that reflects his detachment from morality. In Remake, this idea is not explicitly said on screen, but we can assume that something of the same effect was said. When we look at the Jenova project, it is yet again another example of Hojo's disturbed mind being at work. As mentioned, Lucrezia falls in love with Hojo, not Vincent. It must be that sleek long black hair. Oh, I don't know. She was also a scientist, and after becoming pregnant with Hojo's child, she agreed to an extreme experiment that involved injecting Jenova cells directly into the fetus. It would be called Project S, also known as Project Sephiroth. I think we're right to think this is a dangerous thing, but as far as we know, there was actually consent in the matter, so there's that. When news of this experiment reached Vincent Valentine's ears, he knew he had to do something about it. For context, Vincent was a Turk and was assigned to oversee the work Professor Hojo had been doing. He managed to tolerate the already unethical experiments Hojo had been doing, but when he saw the woman he loved was being used as a test subject, this is where he drew his line, and so he confronted Hojo about it.
You damned fool.
Not only did this not affect Hojo in the slightest, but Lucrezia was still on Hojo's side. Vincent couldn't do anything. All he could do was continue his job as he watched his love interest deteriorate because of the experiment. Once Lucrezia gave birth to Sephiroth, Hojo took the child away from Lucrezia and forbade her to have contact with him, yet again showing a lack of empathy and that he holds his self-interest and goals above all else. And this is when Vincent had enough and decided to confront him one last time. Unfortunately for Vincent, he was shot by Hojo, but he wasn't completely dead, and for Hojo, he's got a new test subject. The experiments that were carried out on Vincent Valentine were horrific. Hojo's goal was to see how much pain the human body could withstand and to see if human bodies can transform itself into different forms. We know that Vincent can transform into the Gallant Beast, which means this was a success for Hojo, right? Well, although there were some successes in the experiment, most of them didn't share that outcome. Ultimately, Hojo had enough of the experiment and labelled Vincent as a failure. At some point, Lucrezia realises that the person she loves is Vincent, not the person who used her as a test subject.
Women.
So she devoted herself to trying to save Vincent's life. The outcome was that Vincent would live, however he would now be immortal because of the methods Lucrezia used. It's left ambiguous what happens to Lucrezia, but she is believed to be alive. Vincent, on the other hand, feels responsible for what happened to Lucrezia and for not stopping Project S, so he locks himself in a coffin in the basement of Shinra Manor. None of this would have occurred if Hojo weren't so obsessed with his work. Vincent becomes a tortured soul because of him. Yet again, the ripples of Hojo's actions appear everlasting in the story. After Zack and Cloud defeat Sephiroth in the Nibelheim incident, Hojo is like, ooh, new test subjects, and takes those who survived the incident for experimentation. Nothing new with this guy, eh? He's obviously fixated with Jenova as, again, he injects the survivors with Jenova cells. The successful subjects were given a dull and inhumane life. They're practically walking corpses that either get ignored by everyone or scorned for their creepy-like behaviour, which is not fair as they are, or were, once people with their own lives. But it was stripped away from them as Hojo made them his project, establishing the reunion theory. It also says something that Zack and Cloud did a heroic thing in trying to save Nibelheim, and their reward for it is to become test subjects for Hojo. Shinra, of course, have no problem with this and rebuilt Nibelheim to cover everything up. But after 4 years, Zack breaks out with a vegetative Cloud. This is a loose end for Shinra, so Zack is killed. Cloud wakes up from his comatose state and watches his best friend die. This broke Cloud's psyche and laid the foundation for his identity crisis. I will say once again, two fates that wouldn't have happened if it weren't for this awful individual. There are many other examples of Hojo outright committing immoral acts, such as letting the fiends on the Shinra 8 ship causing havoc on the passengers and rogue men, because he was curious to see the outcome of what specimen would be created. There's taking Efalna and Aerith without consent and using them as test subjects. In Rebirth, he injects Roche with Jenova cells, which turn him into another part of the reunion theory. Most, if not all, of this is done by his motivation. As I said before, he marches to the beat of his drum, and one of the significant attributes of his character is his ego. As bad as Hojo is, we do have to acknowledge that he is intelligent when it comes to science. He's a director of research and development in Shinra for a reason. He has wide knowledge and is the genius, if you can call it that, behind creating Sephiroth. However, because of his intellect and achievements, he's egotistical to the point where it drives a lot of what he does. Not only does he voice that he thinks of himself as a genius, but he takes no one's opinion but his own into account with every situation he finds himself in, which makes it so he can do pretty much anything he wants. Professor Gast was the previous leader of research and development. He was said to be very intelligent, very likely above the intellect of Hojo. Sephiroth gives us a few lines that portray this idea.
Hojo, from research and development. His predecessor was a great man, but him, he is anything but.
Hojo had an inferiority complex to Gast, and so when presented with the opportunity to get rid of his only intellectual rival, he took it with no hesitation, and thus he became the top dog in the science department of Shinra. He had full control. When it comes to the relationship between Hojo and his son Sephiroth, it is a weird one, and that is putting it lightly. As though biologically he was the father of Sephiroth, Hojo treated him just like a product, showing zero fatherly affection to Sephiroth and continued to monitor him. Instead, Sephiroth was raised in the Shinra facility and has no knowledge of his mother except the name Jenova. This lays a seed within his mind. Hojo kept the truth of his existence a secret. Likely so Sephiroth was kept malleable, and so he didn't plan for Sephiroth to learn about his identity and have a breakdown. However, when it did happen, not only was Hojo not concerned, he was happy that Sephiroth was on the path to realizing his true potential. When we fast forward to when the reunion theory starts taking shape, Hojo is filled with glee when he realizes that the fruits of his labor are manifesting right in front of him. And as Sephiroth progresses closer to his goal of destroying the planet, Hojo embraces this idea. See, it doesn't matter that he didn't have a relationship with his son, because in his eyes, Sephiroth had already fulfilled his purpose as a successful project. It's what Hojo views as his crowning achievement. By the third act of the story, Hojo is way up in the clouds where he's at his most maniacal. He holds nothing back and tells the party and us, the audience, everything. He boasts about the fact that he created Sephiroth and now he is basically responsible for the current state of the planet. And so, wanting to become godlike, Hojo injects himself with Jenova cells and exposes himself to massive amounts of Mako energy, turning him into the very image of his character. This is the pinnacle of his self-centered ego.
But your ego's f***ing me off. You think you're the shit. You think you're so high and mighty.
It is also important to note that Hojo rarely fails in his goals. In fact, Ifalna's death was one of the very few failures. One that was probably a great hit to his ego, as not only did he lose his chance to experiment on a full-blooded ancient, but Shinra also lost their chance to locate the Promised Land. And so the blame is put on Hojo, as if he treated Ifalna and Aerith with a different approach than the one he typically uses, they were probably more likely to cooperate with him. To me, his decision to catalogue every part of Ifalna was both done as she was the last full-blood etc., and out of spite from Hojo, as it was a humiliation that she escaped and died. And Hojo expects all his experiments to have a perfect outcome, and he discards anything that falls short under that definition. And he does this countless times. He calls Cloud a failure of his, and so it's very poetic that the very failure that Hojo discarded is the one to bring about his end. I don't think I will get much pushback by saying that Hojo is the most evil character in Final Fantasy VII. However, some would argue that, no, the killer alien whose goal is to destroy the planet and influences Sephiroth is the true evil. And though I would agree on some level, I do not think Jenova is more villainous than Hojo. My logic is similar to how I view Pennywise. Yes, Pennywise is a terrifying horror villain that eats people. That is something we would call evil. Except we need to acknowledge that it's an alien and that its motivation for killing is to satisfy its hunger. It kills to survive. We don't usually call farmers and hunters evil for killing animals in our world if it means feeding people. Now, when it comes to Jenova, its origins are shrouded in mystery, but we know its motivation is one of destruction. As humans, we know that's a bad thing, and because of this, we impose our common morals onto this alien that might come from a different world where it's the norm to cause terror. So what I'm trying to say is that Jenova is an extraterrestrial being that lives outside the moral space of humans. However, Hojo is a human and is bound to our morals, which makes his actions in the story even worse. Humans do not need to do the things that he does, not just to survive, but also to live a fulfilling life. It is not necessary in the slightest. Yet Hojo does them just because he wants to. I also like how Square Enix pretty much lays it out that the most evil being in the story is a human and not an alien. It's crystal clear what Hojo's impact is on Sephiroth. Everything Sephiroth is and does all leads back to Hojo. There's also some sadness we have for Sephiroth, as we know he was a victim in the situation. A victim of a cold and self-serving man who viewed him as a tool and not an individual. Tifa lost her father and her village because of Sephiroth, but you know why Sephiroth did what he did? Hojo. Vincent is depressed soul because of Hojo. Red 13 loathes Hojo for his unethical treatment of him as a test subject, yet again showing that any living thing is not safe from being used. But the two characters that are most affected are Cloud and Aerith. Cloud's messed up mental state and the majority of the problems he faces is because of the events that occurred in Nibelheim. When it comes to Aerith, the trauma she faced as a child shaped her into who she is. Aerith has this melancholy side to her that she tends to hide, but we see this expressed wonderfully, especially in Rebirth. She and Cloud connect a lot during many scenes that involve this sorrowful side of her, such as her voicing that she hates Hojo for what he did to her and her mother.
After all the pain and the horror he put us through, I hate him.
And that she's envious of the fact that Cloud had a friend when growing up, when her childhood was one of loneliness. So combining all of this, it makes it all the more satisfying when our party defeats him. He's a piece of crap. that's the conclusion. I don't think there's anything else I can say. He represents unchecked science and how fascination can lead to the extreme. As I was writing the script, I was thinking, Hojo would make sense in a Resident Evil game. You know, he creates bioweapons and other monstrosities in the name of scientific advancement, trying to make superhumans, but it's usually always self-serving. In the remake trilogy, they haven't really shied away from the depravity of Hojo. He is just as prevalent, if not more, in the new trilogy. And I am intrigued to see how he's utilised in the final part. Considering we are dealing with worlds and things being different from the original, he has to, at some point, learn what we have come to learn. And considering he is a scientist, it would be really interesting to see how he will interpret things and what evil plans he will create. But I just hope more than anything we will get our glorious justice after everything he has done to our characters. Hojo is a good but hateable villain. But you know, if it wasn't for him, Cloud's character wouldn't exist, so maybe he isn't too bad when you think of it.
But will they get here in time to save you from me?